Welcome back, students. We're going to talk a lot about the Google Cloud in this course. Not all of the services that we discuss will be cloud services, so there'll be other stuff as well. But a lot of this course will be talking about the cloud, and so it's important that we all start out with a basic understanding of what exactly is the cloud. I think we've all heard the term, and most of us at least have some general understanding of what it's all about. But the cloud is just a fancy word for using someone else's server. You're just renting space on somebody else's infrastructure. So this is similar to signing up for a web hosting platform with someone like GoDaddy.com or another web hosting provider if you've done something like that. You choose a hosting plan based on how much storage, memory, and bandwidth you need, and you get access to a web server located in someone else's data center that you can load your website and database to so that it will be accessible to anyone on the internet. Now, some people break out in hives when you start to talk about servers, but the cloud sounds like a much softer experience, and it usually is because Google and other cloud service providers put a lot of effort into making it as easy as possible. You'll see the term quite a bit about it being a managed server, and that refers to the fact that a lot of the infrastructure is managed by Google or the cloud provider, and so there are a lot of things that you don't have to do that you would have to do if you tried to set up your own server. So it's generally easier to use the cloud than setting up your own server. However, it's still using someone else's server, and there are some technical details that you're going to need to understand, and I'm going to try and explain most of those at a basic level, because you won't get too far into using the cloud before you need to know some server-related concepts and terminology. One difference between using the cloud and using a web hosting service is that with the cloud, you don't have to choose a plan based on how much predicted use you will get per month, but you pay only for what you use. So you don't have to guess ahead of time exactly what you'll need. You just pay for what you use, and if your needs are small, it may end up costing nothing or just a couple dollars a month. Now, related to this is that most cloud services include the concept of scalability or elasticity, and this means that if you need to access more resources for a short period of time, the cloud will make them available to you. Of course, you'll pay for them if you use them, but you won't need to build your entire infrastructure around a potential use case that may never or only rarely occur. If the reason for the surge is important, then you don't want your website to fail because you're overusing your resources. On the other hand, if you post a cat video that goes viral and suddenly gets 1 million views, you might get stuck with an unexpected bill. However, you can set usage alerts, and I believe you can set limits on your account, so you can take some steps to prevent that from happening, but it's something to consider even if the chances are slim. Another advantage, as I mentioned, is that the cloud is managed by somebody else. That means that backup is done automatically. It's very easy to have your database replicated in multiple data centers or spread around the world if you want. Security updates are also applied automatically. As a user, you don't have to worry about any of those details. You can just focus on being productive and let Google take care of the rest. There are some core concepts that you will need to understand about the cloud. Compute basically refers to processing power. Heavy-duty analysis workflows will use a lot of computing power. In the Google Cloud, we will hear the term compute engine, and this basically refers to a virtual machine running on a server somewhere that you can use. In the next lecture, we'll talk about a couple specific use cases for a virtual machine, but many of Google's cloud services rely on a virtual machine under the hood. So even if you don't set one up yourself, there's a good chance that the tools that you're using will be running on a virtual machine and you'll be using a compute engine. Storage is another service that is available in the cloud. You can store files in the Google Cloud Storage or structured data in a variety of databases. And bandwidth refers to how much data you're sending back and forth across the internet. You might have a very large and complex data set that occupies 100 gigabytes of space, but that not many people use. Or you might have a small website that only uses 30 megabytes to store a cat video that goes viral and results in massive amounts of bandwidth use. And Google's going to get paid either way, as they should. Now, compute, storage, and bandwidth are the three basic things that you'll pay for in the Google Cloud. It might be relatively easy to think about how much storage costs if you're told it's 2 cents per gigabyte per month. Google is very transparent about its pricing, but it can be a lot more difficult to estimate what your monthly cost will be if you're given a price of 0.0003 cents per megaflop of computing power, or to predict how much bandwidth you will use if you don't know how many people will end up using your site, and how much data each one will actually be sending back and forth across the internet. So for that reason, it can be a little frightening to pay this way without a fixed monthly cost. But rest assured that you can set alerts and limits on your account to avoid any surprises, and Google's free tier is very generous. Plus you get that $300 credit, and you can see your balance at any time, so you'll have a pretty good idea of what things cost by the time you run out of credit. In my experience, you'll be pleasantly surprised at how little things cost for individual users and small companies. Some Google tools like BigQuery will tell you in advance how much an operation will cost before you perform it. For instance, Google charges $5 per terabyte processed in a BigQuery query, and the first 1 terabyte is free, and every query that you write will tell you how much is being processed. I don't think I've ever processed more than 1 terabyte in a month. A query that processes 1 gigabyte would be a huge query for me, and that would cost about half a penny, because mostly I work with smaller data sets. And why is Google so generous? Well, they're focused on larger companies and querying big data that might be terabytes or more per query. They make plenty of money from large companies, and they don't need to worry about folks like me whose needs are very modest. And of course they count on you becoming familiar with their tools and using them if you ever move on to a larger company or have more resource-intensive needs. So they can hook you in by making it free or very cheap to learn and use their services for smaller projects. Another important core concept is what is known as Identity and Access Management, or IAM, which refers to methods for authorizing different users and controlling what each user is allowed to do in the cloud. And this basically refers to a system of users, roles, and permissions. Permissions are assigned to roles, and roles are assigned to users. And each user can have multiple roles. So for example, you might have a database viewer role, and a database editor role, and a database administrator role. A viewer can see the data in the database but not modify it. An editor might be able to change the data, but only the admin would be able to create new tables, add users, or delete data. If you've taken my course on spatial databases, then you know that this type of thing can be handled from within the database itself, giving you very fine-grained control over what each user is allowed to do. And identity and access management basically extends this to all of Google Cloud services. So things like who's allowed to add a file to cloud storage, or who's allowed to start a new virtual machine, or run a query in BigQuery, etc. And there are also some considerations that you should have in the back of your mind, as well as we discuss more about Google's cloud infrastructure. Because the cloud is just a fancy word for using someone else's server, you have to think a little bit about where those servers are located. This is part of the nitty-gritty about using the cloud that Google has not been able to hide from you. You can go to a web browser and search for Google regions, and you'll see that Google has data centers located all over the world, and they're building new ones all the time. And you have to choose a location where your data will be housed. What you do will work wherever you choose because it's all connected to the internet, but it's a good rule of thumb to choose a data center that's close to where most of your users will be. Why host a website in India if all of its users will be in Seattle? That would just unnecessarily clog up resources like undersea data connections. If you've taken my course on databases, we've talked briefly about replication. This just means that your data is replicated on multiple servers. For redundancy, in case one server fails, the replicated server will automatically pick up the slack. And this makes for a very secure and high availability service. It also means that you're using more processing power, storage space, and bandwidth. So it will cost more as well. With Google Cloud Infrastructure, you'll have the option to replicate your database on multiple servers within a region or in multiple regions around the globe, and they make it very easy to do that. So if you're a large company and it's absolutely critical that your site is available 100% of the time. You might want to spend the money to do this. If you're just starting out and you're very concerned about the cost, you may want to just stick with one server, which is still very safe and secure, but it's considerably less expensive, even though there's more risk involved. And you'll also need to think a bit about security and whether you will need your database and other cloud services to be accessible over the internet. To me, the answer to the question about how much security do you need depends on your data and its value. A basic level of security is fairly easy to implement. By that, I mean password protection and preventing your average computer user from accessing your data. And this is fine for many purposes. In fact, it's been fine for anything that I've done in my career, but the data that I generally work with has not been that valuable. We wouldn't want to give it away to our competitors, for instance, but it's not like anyone's going to pay tens of thousands of dollars to pay somebody to hack into our data. Nobody's going to put that much effort into finding the locations of prairie dog towns, for instance. They're not that hard to find. But the internet world is full of hackers just wanting to disrupt things, so you'll want some basic security. As your data becomes more valuable and something people might consider that is worth the effort to hack through your basic security, then you might want to consider some additional measures. Ultimately, however, anything that's accessible on the internet is potentially insecure. It's just a matter of how difficult you want or need to make it. In my courses on web development and spatial databases, I teach basic levels of security, and as I said, that has always been sufficient for me. If you think you'll need more than basic levels of security, please consider hiring a security consultant. I'm certainly not an expert, and I don't want to be. There are other things I'd rather spend my time on, but there are very good people out there, and many of them will be very familiar with the Google Cloud, and they can help you assess whether you need to do anything additional to prevent hackers from accessing your data. All right, thanks for listening. In the next lecture, I'm going to talk a little bit about what tools are available in the Google Cloud and from Google APIs and other services that might be of interest to a geospatial professional. And we'll just talk briefly about each of them so you have an idea of what's coming up, and then we'll start to dive in deep and I'll show you how to use each one of them. And we'll see you in the next lecture.